Why did Northern soldiers burn the farm and execute the family of Josey Wales 3 years before the American Civil War started? The outlaw Josey Wales was released to theaters in 1976, starring Clint Eastwood in the title role. The screenplay was based on the 1973 novel The Rebel Outlaw, Josey Wales, which was later renamed to Gone to Texas. Gone to Texas starts in 1866 with ex-Confederate militiaman Josey Wales on the run from the law after the American Civil War. Or, as author Forrest Carter preferred to call it, the war between the states. The story quickly flashes back to 1858, to his last days as a farmer in the hills of Missouri. He hitched his mules to the turning plow in the dark of morning and waited in the fields. Rested on his plow stalk for the first dim light that would allow him to plow. It was a long time before Josey saw the smoke rising that spring morning of 1858. He hadn't looked up until he heard the shots. It was then he saw the smoke. It rose black-gray over the ridge. It could only be the house. He had left the mules, running barefoot, wildly, through the briars and sumac, across the rocky gullies. There had been little left when he fell, exhausted, into the swept clearing. In the film, he tried to stop the attack. But in the novel, it was already over, and Josey Wales never saw his family's attackers. The timbers of the cabin had fallen in. The fire was a guttering smoke that had already filled its appetite. He had found them, his wife and son, there in what had been the kitchen. He dug their single grave beneath the big water oak at the edge of the yard, and as darkness fell and moonlight silvered over the ruins, great tears rolled down the smoked face of Josey Wales. It was the last time Josey Wales would cry. Chapter 2 provides historical background on the attack. Though raiding had taken place back and forth across the Missouri-Kansas border since 1855, the burning of Josey Wales' cabin was the first of the Kansas Red Leg raids to hit Cass County, Missouri. The Red Legs were anti-slavery militia volunteers, named for their maroon leggings, who years later were absorbed into and disbanded by the Union Army. They led looting armies of pillagers into Missouri. Beneath a thinly disguised cause, they set the border aflame. As we'll soon see, that cause was anti-slavery and revenge for recent injustices in the fight for the state of Kansas. The seeds of war were planted just a few years earlier in what eventually became the central United States. As described in the 1996 biography of William Quantrill, who was an infamous leader of the Confederate militia before the American Civil War. In 1854, the U.S. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which one historian described as the most important single event pushing the nation towards civil war. The danger lay with Kansas, which had a 270-mile border with Missouri, a slave state, and whether Kansas would be a free or slave state was to be resolved by the doctrine of squatter sovereignty. The residents of each territory would decide for themselves. In effect, the side that got there first with the most settlers would win, or should. The rush was on to populate the new Kansas territory with sufficient numbers of people who would vote the right way. It would be a holy crusade on both sides. In Massachusetts, the center of the movement to abolish slavery, Amos Lawrence, a textile millionaire, financed the New England Immigrant Aid Society. Hundreds of settlers from Massachusetts and other northern states joined in the Kansas Crusade. One of the first communities to be established was Lawrence, named after Amos Lawrence, its patron. Among Missouri's southern-leaning residents, tempers mounted as more and more wagons carrying Yankees passed through on their way to Kansas. Hundreds of Missourians began swarming over the border to settle towns where no free staters were welcome. An election was scheduled for March 1855 for Kansans to vote for their first representatives to the territorial legislature. Missourians vowed to ensure that only pro-slavery men were voted in. The ferries across the Missouri River were so full that other boats had to be pressed into service, and the Great California Road heading west from Missouri into Kansas was jammed with men. The Missourians won. The final tally was 6,307 ballots, more than twice the number of legal voters. 39 legislators were elected, 36 of whom were pro-slavery. These legislators passed pro-slavery anti-abolition laws that only increased the hostility between the northern and southern communities in Kansas and Missouri. In November 1855, a Missouri squatter in Kansas killed a Free State man over a land dispute, which had nothing to do with the slavery issue. The pro-slavery Missouri sheriff refused to arrest the killer. After all, it was only an abolitionist who got himself killed. The Kansas regulators, anti-slavery militia, decided to try to capture the killer, but he escaped. In retaliation, the regulators set fire to several cabins belonging to pro-slavery men. Rising anger from these events led to a standoff between 1,500 Missouri militiamen and the residents of Lawrence, Kansas. But the crisis de-escalated when the pro-slavery leader convinced the militia to disperse. In the spring of 1855, politician James H. Lane came from Indiana and joined the cause of the Free Soilers, sensing the path to a bright political future for himself. The film shows Lane when he was a Kansas senator after the war, in a fictional scene where he executes surrendering Confederate militiamen. By 1856, Lane was a hero to the Free Soilers in Kansas and to the abolitionist groups he spoke to back east. Lane and others like him in the North and South were effective spokesmen for their causes, and emigration to Kansas from both camps increased markedly. County governments and individuals provided financial incentive for people to move to Kansas, and the violence escalated. In the early months of 1856, a Free Soiler by the name of E.P. Brown was waylaid and beaten to death by a bunch of half-drunk pro-slavery men. In April 1856, the previously mentioned Missouri sheriff came to Lawrence to stir up trouble, and was chased out of town by gunshots. In response, hundreds of Missourians who called themselves border ruffians invaded Lawrence. They ransacked the town and burned down the Free State Hotel. This was only a prelude to the much more violent raid that would come years later. Meanwhile, still in 1856, the violence even escalated in the halls of Congress in Washington. Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina used a wooden cane with a gold head to beat Charles Sumner of Massachusetts almost to death. Many people were enraged by the attack, including a 56-year-old abolitionist from Kansas named John Brown. Brown gathered a small gang of men, including his own sons, to attack the homes of known pro-slavery men. They executed 5 of them with pistols and swords. By the way, some people today are taught to idolize John Brown because of his fight against slavery. I recommend you be careful about making heroes out of murderers before a violent mob comes to your house because of your beliefs. Through the remaining months of 1856, the border counties of Kansas and Missouri became, as one account stated, a seething hell. Every week saw another attack, an ambush, a bloody skirmish between the two sides. Many Free Soilers, expecting a full-scale invasion from Missouri, left their farms to form militias, meaning the Redlegs and Jayhawkers. In this illustration, Jim Lane led a group of Kansas militia against a group of border ruffians who took shelter in log cabins in Jefferson County, Kansas. Every day men were wounded and killed, houses and barns torched, cattle and horses stolen. Terrified innocent people packed up their belongings and fled for safety. The violence, which had become commonplace, came to a halt in 1857, and a strange and unfamiliar peace settled over the border regions. No one was quite sure why it happened. Perhaps the men simply grew tired of the killing, or even disgusted. As one Kansan put it, the territory was weary of war and worn out of the conflict. This is when the fictional Josey Wales moved his family from Tennessee to Missouri. Josey Wales, with his young wife and baby boy, had come to Cass County, Missouri. Their first year, 1857, he obligated himself for 40 acres of flat land. He had built the house with his own hands and raised a crop, and now this year, 1858, he had obligated for 40 more acres. But sadly for them and hundreds of real people living at that time, the peace did not last. Toward the end of 1857, a band of Missouri pro-slavery border ruffians swept into Kansas, burning houses and crops, stealing horse and cattle, and looting homes and businesses. The Free Staters responded by launching their own raid with a small army of Kansas Jayhawkers. Missourians counterattacked across the border and shot some of the Jayhawkers who had participated in the previous raid. The violence continued into the early months of 1858, but by summer a shaky truce was being maintained. Unfortunately, the truce came too late for the fictional Josey Wales and his family. As far as we know from the story, they had done nothing wrong and never voiced support for slavery. But the Kansas-Missouri border war continued to consume innocent lives and turned peaceful men into killers. Josey Wales had taken to the brush, and there he found others. They were guerrilla veterans, these young farmers, by the time the war between the states began. And as regular soldiers got involved in the fighting, the formalities of government and conflict only meant an occupying army that drove them deeper into the brush. They already had their war. There were no lines, there were no rules. Theirs was a war to the knife, of burned barn and ravaged countryside, of looted home and outraged womenfolk. It was a blood feud. The black flag became a flag of honorable warning. We ask no quarter, we give none. And they didn't. Shockingly, the violence between Kansas and Missouri escalated even worse, which will be addressed in another video. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and see the links in the description below to rewatch The Outlaw Josey Wales and read Gone to Texas.